This is a reading of Chapter 37, Unions in Detroit. It's from Business Advice from Billy-Bubba's Dumbass Texas Muffler Shop. Chapter 37, Unions and Detroit. When I lived in Germany, there were unions all over the place, more so than here. I knew about unions in America despite having lived in the South, where there are a few of them, because some of my relatives lived in the Chicago area, one of the main union bastions in the United States. In America, if you wanted to get a job a few years ago, you had to join the union. But if you were black or Jewish or Latin American, you could forget it. The unions proudly boasted that the union label represented "Made in America by white men." This embarrassing chapter in their history is something they do not want remembered and have shifted gears on this issue. I am sure if pressed on this point, they would argue along historical lines that while they are not proud of this, that they had to get a foothold in the door and did so by going along with the then prevalent attitudes, but have actually helped America to grow, that they themselves have helped America to banish this outmoded style of racist thinking. That's interesting. By promoting it, they were then able to eliminate it. It's sort of like Jefferson Davis saying he seceded and fought the Civil War so he could end the process of slavery. But they are still sure big on class divisiveness, and now it is poor guy versus rich guy instead of white guy versus black guy. The idea is now put forth by them that there are only 5 ways to get rich: steal it, be born rich, marry a rich girl, win the lottery, or inherit it. They never even think about the main obvious ways of getting rich: to work hard, invest your money, start a business, get a trade, an education. One of the main differences in Germany is who gets to join. Americans are surprised to learn that almost everyone, including most management people, can be union members in Germany. It weirds out socialist-leaning American union guys to even think about a scenario where management people are in the union. In Germany, the union guy rep comes to the board meeting and the management guy comes to the labor meeting. There is actually more communism-type thinking in America with American union people than there is in Germany or even present-day Russia. Germany seems to understand and agree with the principles of capitalism, whereas American union guys almost universally have never thought the concepts through, and they adhere to the very bedrock of socialism and communism. And they are accompanied by Congress and the President and supported by the Supreme Court and academia. Another difference between German unions and the American unions is wages. In the US, if the contract calls for machinist 2 getting $12 an hour, then every machinist 2 gets $12. Those who perform well, those who perform poorly. And this scenario leads to very poor productivity and shoddy workmanship. In America, in Germany, if the contract calls for 12 euros, then no one can get less, but most receive more than that, depending on what employee and his boss resolve come wage review. Usually in Germany, only drunks and less than speedy new hires receive union scale wages. Why do I bring up this union stuff? I do so because small independently owned businesses, even franchised businesses, are not unionizable in any practical sense. A small place with 3-4 guys is almost impossible to get unionized, and for that reason, the unions do not even try. For another reason, if small businesses were to get unionized, they would go bankrupt from mismanagement within a half year. In fact, most 3-guy businesses in America are not even slim pickings for the other kind of unionization activity that commonly occurs. There are some 100-people outfits, 3 generations old, who are approached by union guys all the time. The owner quakes in his shoes during the interview, but the union guy says, "Hey, we're not really interested in old-time, relatively small businesses like yours, and we're not even going to attempt to organize your workers into a union, but we would appreciate it if you could help us out." What do they want? They want a small donation to the DNC, and that will keep the union out. Tom Hagen was particularly good at this. It is hard on the racehorse population, and you don't hear about it too much. But you are so totally naive if you don't think this happens every single day of the week. This kind of shakedown, the kind popularized and done so well by Jesse Jackson, is also used by other government agencies like the EPA, OSHA, and the local fire departments. The deal is unions are effective in unionizing large groups of people, but they have to belong to the same company or the same industry. I'm wondering how it would be possible for an approach to work with franchises, but I am not that imaginative. Who in his right mind would willingly purchase a pre-unionized franchise? But perhaps I am being closed-minded. Who in his right mind would enslave himself by buying a franchise? Lots of people. But in Germany, a very small business with 3-4 guys very often has the owner and his guys all union members. It's like a sense of belonging to a profession, that you are part of a group of guys who proudly repairs cars. And strike? Who's the owner going to strike against? Himself? Then why do they even have it there? I think it's because they like a sense of belonging, and also getting great El Fribo magazines offering special vacation deals only for car mechanics, and maybe a cool new MasterCard proclaiming the guy who fixes cars. Who knows? Why do guys join Elks, Moose, Kiwanis, Rotary? Some people just like to belong to stuff. Look at what is unionized in America. It has varied over the years, who and at what percentage. It had reached up to maybe 20%, maybe more. It depends on who is counting and what the counter's axe to grind is. It seems to me it was very regional, only in older manufacturing areas, mining, large industries. When the U.S. lost its manufacturing sector, it did so in part because wages overseas are cheaper, but also because the unions and bad government more or less drove businesses, after having milked them dry, out of the U.S. Why do manufacturing here? What for? It's crazy. Then the weirdest darn thing happened. Something so very strange, so that it is impossible for a rational person to justify. The very base, the very bedrock of union membership changed. The reduced union membership of manufacturing is now revived in 2 other totally unexpected areas. And the first area of new union membership is minorities. Minorities were now suddenly welcomed with open arms by the unions. In a sudden turnaround, the formerly racist unions now invited Latinos and blacks. The all-white union label campaign was swept under the rug, and black people were now being courted with full vigor. The black people were all Democrats anyway, so it was not much of a stretch for them to also embrace the unions, whose philosophy is nearly identical with all aspects of left-leaning thinking. Besides, who can remember remote and obscure history? So what if the Republicans had a hand in freeing slaves? Those guys are all dead. What have Republicans done lately? And they are really cold fucking sons of bitches, ignoring the plight of black America, neither helping nor hindering. May I relate a little bird story regarding that issue? It's an allegory, not a real story. This little black bird starts his winter migration south a bit late in the season and hits bad weather. He rests a while in a snow-covered field and falls asleep, and the cold's about to kill him. A Republican cow, not knowing the little bird is there, takes a poop, and the warm cow pie revives the birdie. He knows he's going to live and begins to sing in joy. A Democrat cat hears the bird and eats him. And the moral? Just because someone seems uncaring and accidentally shits on you doesn't mean he's necessarily your enemy. And similarly, if someone gets you out of shit, he may not necessarily be your friend, might in fact be your enemy. Unsophisticated minorities and foreigners do not know any better, though, and are prey for Caps, unions, and socialists and communists. And Jews, who can understand Jewish thinking, if there is such a thing? I'm not Jewish myself, but I sympathize entirely and wholeheartedly with the plight of Jews who faced centuries of anti-Semitism by my nominally Christian antecedents, culminating with Nazism. A real dilemma of paradoxical thinking, the well-documented history of a totalitarian regime using Jews as scapegoats, and now another totalitarian regime in the form of unions, communism, and socialism attracting left-leaning Jews. It's like Lucy and Charlie Brown. Here, I'll hold the football for you, and you can kick it. The left will yank it away faster than Lucy just as soon as they get the chance. But in the meantime, the new label says, proudly made by Jewish, Latino, Black, and left-leaning union members. I can understand Latino recruitment just as easily. There's a language barrier which actually helps recruitment. The non-English speaking immigrants do not even know union history or even U.S. history or anything about business or management or even capitalism. They're very much like the coal miners in Émile Zola's Germinal. Only know that the fat cat mine owners seem to be living very well, seemingly at the workers' expense. It is easy, so very easy, for an organizer to work them up. They have been rounded up like bovine cattle, not for slaughter, but to corral and put in some socialist harness. You can slaughter them later after getting them to work for you. The second totally unexpected source of union membership is government workers. This is so bizarre a phenomenon, it is still not just hard to believe. I find it absolutely impossible to believe. I have to relate it to Zola again. I can certainly understand the origin of unions from the unsafe working conditions of 19th century coal mines. The miners grouped together and demanded safer working conditions, and they put pressure on the owners, the stockholders, the CEOs, management to implement safety rules, safety equipment, safety training. I can sure understand that. And this is in just one area, the area of safety. There are also wages, retirement, hiring, firing rules, all the things that concern workers. But in the main, it is an us versus them attitude, an adversarial approach, labor versus management. It even sounds like a constantly ongoing, never-ending lawsuit, two lawyers stuck in an eternal hell, forever litigating in a courtroom ruled over by Satan himself. So who is the uncaring evil management that government workers have to guard themselves against? The government? They actually have the gall to suggest that the evil government might mistreat them as employees? It's unbelievable. Many generations ago, it was common to describe a government worker as underpaid and underworked. Unions used to say that non-unionized factories had employees who were underpaid and overworked. Presumably, the unions thought of themselves as paid just right and worked the right amount for those wages. It was common observation that although the government worker workload was not onerous, they had the benefit of having very secure, lifelong employment, even if the wages were low. People used to look down on the government workers as less than ambitious, less than hardworking. Now the trend has partially reversed. The workload is still low, The jobs are still temporarily lifetime and very secure, but the wages and benefits and job security actually surpass that of private sector employment. The sense of entitlement is incredible. Just listening to NEA teachers at a union rally makes you certain you want to yank your kids away from such an influence. Their bizarre thought content would turn your kids into socialists for sure. It would certainly ruin them for capitalism. Job pressure is still low, teacher complaints notwithstanding. What about teachers? There is pressure from students, but the jobs themselves, worry about losing the jobs due to fluctuations in the economy, used to be non-existent. I heard a horrible story once from the Bangladesh War of 1970. The Pakistan Army needed blood for blood transfusions for their wounded, so they rounded up a few thousand guys for that purpose. Instead of taking a pint, they exsanguinated them. They bled them to death. This is what the unions are doing to capitalism, our U.S. economy, to manufacturing, and now, finally, to our very government. Have you ever heard that little ditty about pigs? It goes something like, hogs get fat, but pigs get slaughtered. Or maybe it's the other way around. It means you can take a little bit, even enough to get fat. But if you take too much, it will destroy the source. This totally unexpected rise of unionized government workers is such a real head-scratcher of an idea. Is it even legal? And I'm serious. How can employees of the actual government link hands in an adversarial block against the government, as though the government were an uncaring 19th century French coal mine? It is so absurd a notion, the mindset of this. I am certain that dead government workers are now trying to unionize both heaven and hell. Good luck trying to collectively bargain with Satan, but just think about it. Why in heaven's name would residents of heaven even bother trying to get a card count in heaven? The mindset of such people is such that they will not be happy until heaven is a worker's paradise. Probably the other people in heaven will have to take a second job because God has had to raise taxes on non-unionized dead people who are pulling the wagon. Property taxes for dead people have got to go up. It is so wholly entrenched, this government union, that it is now a huge voting bloc and the power base for the Democratic Party, so much so that the bailout was not of the auto industry in Detroit, but rather a bailout of the union workers, a payback. They took my money, your money, and your children's and grandchildren's and great-grandchildren's money, and they gave it to a rotten, dishonest, mismanaged union. They said it was necessary and too big to fail. The implication was that if the Detroit auto industry did fail, that the U.S. might fail. Oh, really? Who but a total idiot would believe that? Didn't Studebaker fail? Didn't American Motors fail? Capitalism is a process. It is a continuous, fluid readjustment of economic forces. I think socialists and communists and union people and government people do not understand this. They are naive and they want everything static. But businesses are born tiny. They grow, they get sick, they get well, they mature, they grow powerful and rich, they go broke, get deathly sick, eventually they all die. And some of them have children and leave wills. New businesses get born in just as great a number as old businesses die. It's like life, and it has to be that way. You may want to live forever, but I'm sorry to tell you the big guy didn't design the universe that way. You're gonna die. And so is each and every business, and there will be new businesses who get born. Capitalism has a delivery room for new babies and a funeral home for old ones. But the U.S. Constitution does not have a clause in it saying that your tax money was going to be used to put certain union-owned businesses in a nursing home on perpetual life support. This is one reason why there are corporations. They are artificial human beings who exist only on paper. It is absolutely necessary for there to be a constant birth and death of businesses, even gigantic ones like General Motors. The same damn congressman who said Microsoft was too big and therefore had to be broken up also said GM was too big to fail. What's the difference? The difference is that the unions all owned the congressman, bribed them with money and power, whereas Bill Gates did not kick in a dime. You may ask, well, why haven't we put some of these sons of bitches in prison? We certainly can't put them in prison if we can't even vote them out of office. First things first. GM made money only from new car financing for years. Blind people could see its collapse coming. Deaf people knew what was coming. Retarded idiots, people in vegetative states, communists in China and Russia, knew how, when, and why GM was going to go. Entire cemeteries full of dead people, the very rocks and trees, all knew about this. The only people who did not, apparently, were the unions and the U.S. government. They did not care. Not really. For them, it was a grand opportunity to pull a fast one, grab some loot, and grab some power. The U.S. taxpayer would foot the bill. Kerkorian wanted to buy Chrysler before it collapsed. He believed he could turn it around and revive it just as Iacocca had done. If he had bought Chrysler, it would have surged. The best thing that could have happened for the U.S. economy would have been the orderly collapse of GM and Chrysler. It would have been an opportunity for a reorganization and revitalization of the industry. Various individuals and corporations would have bought segments of GM. Some of the owners would have been foreign, but actually that would have been all right. I think Toyota's U.S. workforce employs a gazillion U.S. citizens, more so than the number of Toyota employees in Japan. One group was intent upon just Saturn. Another group could have bought, say, just Cadillac. The individually owned smaller groups would have, at least some of them, been successful and made better cars, new blood, new thinking, better, cheaper products, above all, real, viable companies. A really helpful U.S. government could have speeded along the orderly bankruptcy and reorganization of GM and Chrysler. Above all, the U.S. Congress would not have allowed the theft of money from the secured creditors at the expense of union bailout. The way it is now, comrades, I fear GM really is and always will be government motors, union motors, subsidized motors, environmental motors. Where's my own loyalty in this? I watched Congress call Mr. Toyota on the carpet and excoriate him for inexplicable, undocumented safety problems. All of those congressmen were on the take. It was a zoo. The whole of it was an attack on Toyota's well-run success when compared to the clusterfuck of Detroit government union. When the dust settled, when all was said and done, nobody could find even one bad Toyota. It was all a lie. It cost Toyota a lot of money, and GM thought it was buying time. But even a setback of such magnitude, it did not make any difference. Toyota is still head and shoulders, financially and morally, above anything and everything socialists might produce. GM ought to just come right out and produce a new model and call it the Trabant. The Trabant was the USSR's best in-house car from East Germany. Two-stroke oil-burning engine, fiberglass body, cheap, non-reliable, 2-year waiting list. It was the worst piece of shit ever made. Not that technocrats from East Germany could not do better, but it was the best you could do under the jackboots of communism. Why hasn't Toyota and Honda been producing diesel small cars in the US? Europe's full of them. That's the way to go. You can bet your bottom dollar it is not a technical, environmental, or economic decision. It is probably that Congress has made it impossible for them to do so, since such an advantage would blow Detroit away, since Detroit is totally unable to make a small diesel. You remember the Cadillac and Oldsmobile diesel? People actually removed the diesel engines and put in standard gas engines. They didn't work. Remember the Chevy Citation? It was the first U.S. venture, more or less, into the tried and proved front-wheel drive concept, and it was a total flop. The Fiero? Do you remember GM actually hired a whore and a photographer and tried to photograph Ralph Nader? How is it that GM actually knew where to find a whore and a photographer? Detroit could not get with radial tires, disc brakes, sealed beams, front-wheel drive, or McPherson struts for decades after the rest of the world had actually implemented the changes. Big companies have such an economy of scale they can afford to hire idiots, even CEO idiots. If a big company is doing well, well and good. If a big company is doing poorly, they have enough time to turn it around. If they don't turn it around, it will collapse like the Roman Empire. They were too big to fail too, and it took centuries for the collapse. I can see it now. In 300 AD, they would have tried to unionize the bread and circus workers for shorter hours, better retirement benefits, higher wages. Did you know there used to be a European lion, the same kind as in Africa? They were all used up for the Roman circus. The American capitalist lion is being all used up. They are leaving the country. Just because a guy is rich does not mean he cannot be a gung-ho socialist. It seems an oxymoron, it seems counterintuitive, but there are a whole bunch of socialist multimillionaires, even billionaires. Some of them stay here and assuage their guilt of having become rich, and in so doing feel they must at least talk the talk of the left, but more often than not help to collapse the West, capitalism, and the U.S. The others only talk the talk and just take their capital to other parts of the world. Whole boatloads of brains, cash, and ingenuity have left and are presently leaving the U.S. The smart money always goes where there is opportunity. If there is no longer a good climate in the U.S., the money will go elsewhere. I personally like the fact that the Roman Empire collapsed. It did not mean the end of civilization and the beginning of the Dark Ages. That's the way union guys talk. It was the end of slavery and the beginning of 1,000 little experiments in government. Experiments, some of them lasting centuries, culminating with the very real success of the U.S. Constitution. Do you remember how the U.S. government hounded Microsoft? Senators and congressmen strutted and posed before cameras asking for a show of hands who used Microsoft, and when a majority of people so indicated, then declared, "Gentlemen, that's what I call a monopoly." The real reason for the hatred of Microsoft by the senators and congressmen was that Bill Gates was doing just fine, thank you, and found it unnecessary to apply for government subsidies, loans, programs, regulations. Oh, I forgot. Bill Gates also did not funnel money into the Senate and Congress either. The senators and Congress wanted to regulate Microsoft because they were jealous of its wealth and well-being, and many, many senators and congressmen felt they were entitled to some of that money. They wanted to wet their beaks. Microsoft had a lot of money to tap and was not playing ball. Bill Gates did not find it necessary to ask for government help to keep the foreigners at bay. Congress wanted to break up Microsoft into pieces, and they could plunder each piece. Our totally idiotic Vice President Al Gore actually wanted to subsidize computer ownership for minorities and poor people. Computer prices are dropping daily, becoming more powerful daily, and his socialist dreams of controlling the populace would have contributed to the weakening of the computer industry. Think about the computer industry. It is very much like the car manufacturing industry. Detroit was to the decades of the 20s through the 70s as Redmond is to the 80s to the present. We lost Detroit due to poor management, unions, and government interference. The same thing could happen to the computer industry. There were actually two separate computer revolutions. You could say the first was the software and hardware of the 80s. The second was the internet of the 90s. And both are still going strong. Both saved our butt in the US. Without the computer, we would already have been toast. Without the computer, the US would already have become a third world Marxist shithole. And I thank God for the computer. I have a sense of optimism for the US, and I think we have additional economic miracles. The ones that come to mind are nanotech, robotics, and genetic. If we allow socialism, government, or unions to interfere with their emergence, this country is over with. Well, that is chapter 37, Unions and Detroit. It is from a book entitled Business Advice from Billy-Bubba's Dumbass Texas Muffler Shop. All my opinions. My name is Pop. I have a whole bunch of videos on YouTube. If you enjoyed it, I thank you very much for listening. If you disagree, heck, I'll listen to your comments. Well, thank you very much.